All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. This is an educational channel, and we've been trying to educate you by teaching you different things, theories, discoveries that you probably have never heard of before. But if you did, they would impact your life. And we've been doing a lot of Bible decodes from the New Testament. We just got done going through, we've been focusing lately on the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. And we were going over a book by Michael Menescatz, Menasgotz, called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And this is one of many books from new scholarship on the Roman origins hypothesis. That is, that the Romans were the ones who wrote the New Testament. Not just the Romans, but the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty and their court, whoever was in their employ. And the Flavian dynasty were the Caesars named Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they were emperors of Rome from 69 until 96 AD. The theory goes basically that the Romans, particularly Vespasian and Titus, who were veterans of the war between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD, wanted to use these writings as a psychological operation, the writings about Jesus, as a psychological operation in order to pacify or tame or prune or domesticate the Jews. Because for over a century, the Jews had been a royal pain in the butt for the Caesars, trying to govern them because of their separatist religion with all of these quirky rituals that they had to follow. It all made it very difficult to assimilate them into the empire, and the Jews were literally willing to die for their beliefs, and the Romans were happy to kill them, but they just didn't have the resources to put to all of the uprisings and revolts and revolutions of the Jews. They were like the highest maintenance group in the whole empire. And the Romans were trying to govern dozens, if not hundreds, of different nations, different tribes. And so, they wanted to lessen their burden a little bit by, taking advantage of the fact that the Jews were literally waiting for a Messiah. But the Messiah that they were waiting for was a political, military, a Messiah who was going to rise up, motivate other Jews to rise up to overthrow the Romans. And so the Romans instead decided to write a story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' backpack and turning the other cheek to oppression, calling the faith of the Roman slave owner the greatest in all of Israel, and exhorting his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do, while at the same time going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the money changers who were trying to turn the dirty money of the Romans with the graven images on it to the kosher money of the Jews so that it could be brought into the temple, and disrupting the commerce of the Jews who were out there selling small animals, pigeons and doves, in order to bring them into the temple for the sacrifice. And so Jesus is taking direct aim at the Jewish rituals, the things that made them so separatist, and at the same time being utterly deferential to Rome. And then you will also find that Paul is even more deferential to Rome than Jesus was. Most scholars believe that Paul was written before the Gospels, but this research looks like it goes in the opposite direction, and that the Pauline epistles were written much later than the Gospels. But even so, the Gospels were, scholars say that Mark was written probably in the 70s, and Luke and Matthew in the 80s, John later. Some people have different theories about that. But the basic idea is that they were all, according to that line of thinking, they were written during the Flavian period. And they were backdated by 40 years. The events occurred, according to the story, in the 30s AD. But at the same time, they wrote a history of this war between the Jews and the Romans. And the protagonists of this story are Vespasian and Titus, who were generals in that war before they eventually became emperors. Vespasian was the general from about 66 to 70, Titus from 70 to 73, 66 to 69 really, because he became emperor in 69, but it does take a long time probably to travel all the way from Palestine to Rome. So I'm not exactly sure how the dating is. But basically, they were there for they were each in charge for about 3.5 years. And so they wrote this 7-volume history of this war between the Jews and the Romans. It called it the Jewish War. And they wrote it under the name of Flavius Josephus. Flavius, meaning he's a member of the Flavian dynasty. And you probably have heard of Josephus before, because he is the guy that corroborates the existence of Jesus, because he makes a few asides to the existence of Jesus in his writings. So most Christians believe that Josephus is crucial evidence for the existence of Jesus until you open the book. And then you recognize that Josephus is powerful evidence against the existence of Jesus, because the story in War of the Jews is constantly reminiscent of the story in the Gospels. The amount of parallels between the two are staggering, and whoever wrote one wrote the other. I don't personally believe that Josephus existed. I believe he's just a pen name and a story of whoever was writing at the court of Vespasian and Titus. Whoever, possibly this guy named Arius Piso, who was a close relative of theirs. Also, no doubt, Pliny the Younger in a later period. And other members of the Piso family. Pliny the Younger was a younger stepbrother of Arius Piso, and also very close relative to Titus and Vespasian. But regardless who Josephus was, whoever Josephus was, that's the author of the New Testament. One example of many, many examples of parallels between the two is the military campaign of Titus, as described in War of the Jews. It is identical to the 3-year ministry of Jesus in the New Testament. Every place that Titus goes to fight a battle or engage in some type of intrigue or adventure, Jesus also goes to those same locations. And they go into these locations in the same order. And wherever they go, Titus has some type of adventure, some type of episode, some type of circumstances. And Jesus has parallel events happening to him. Not the same, but parallel, like typologically or analogous parallels. And the events are separated by 40 years, sometimes to the hour. And we're not just talking about a couple of events, we're talking about a couple of dozen events, like 40, in the low 40s, I think, 45, something like that, of events that are in the same order in both books. But that's just the beginning of it. There are also many prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament, predicting his second coming and predicting the fall of Jerusalem. Most of these prophecies are fulfilled in the pages of War of the Jews. And a lot of them are fulfilled specifically by Titus, which makes Titus the second coming of Jesus, which is exactly what the Romans were trying to do. They were trying to convince the Jews to worship Caesar without recognizing that they were worshiping Caesar. And they were trying to hijack the entire Jewish tradition, the lineage that went all the way back to Adam, through Noah, through Abraham, through David, and all the way up to Jesus. And then the second coming of Jesus is Titus. We're still waiting for the second coming of Jesus 1,950 years later. But if you read War of the Jews, you will stop looking for it. And that's just scratching the surface of the level of parallels that are involved, though. Michael Menescotz, in his book Christianity's Origins, digs into the book of Luke looking for parallels. And he found, just in the book of Luke, over 250 parallels between it and War of the Jews. That's more than one every 5 verses. And a lot of the parallels last for 5 verses or more. So the book of Luke is completely saturated with parallels. And not only that, but Menescotz actually graphed the parallels, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and the War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, and plotting points at each place that there is a parallel. And after doing that, you can see that he has constructed 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Caesars. Now, Greek was also the language of the Caesars in Rome. Most Roman royals spoke and wrote in both. Greek was much less common in Judea. The New Testament and Josephus are both written in Greek. And the Romans had a monopoly on censorship, they had a monopoly on publishing, they had a monopoly on distribution. They were really the only entity who could have done this. And this is exactly right down the alley of their MO. The psychological operation using word games, puns, riddles, enigmas, codes, aliases, and also creating religions. Titus we know that it created at least 2 other religions. Vespasian created at least 1 other religion. So this is not like out of character for them. But what's more is its explanatory power. And that's kind of what we're looking at today. We're going over this book by a Christian apologist named Lee Strobel, who used to work for the Chicago Tribune and as a legal writer. And so he went around the country interviewing Christian apologist scholars, and they would present for him the case for various aspects of the Christian theology. So the book's called The Case for Christ, and it's one of those books that you would get from somebody who's trying to convert you to Christianity. What's very interesting about this book is he goes over the evidence from about 12 or 15 different scholars, and they make the case for Christ, but they don't know it, but they actually make the case for Caesar even better than the case for Christ. So I can't remember the name of the author that we're interviewing right here, but this is where we left off. And this is a mind-boggling one. The Bible considers it praiseworthy to have a faith that does not require evidence. That's pretty much strike 1, strike 2, and strike 3 for me. It reminds me of Abraham being told by Yahweh to go kill Isaac, and if you're supposed to be God and you're telling me to do that, then screw you. I'm out. Forget it. I don't want you to be God then, and I don't believe in you because you're not God, because you're asking me to do something that goes against the truth. I don't need to be believing in a religion that does not require evidence. And he says the Bible considers that because he says, remember how Jesus replied to doubting Thomas, you believe because you see. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. But then he says, and I know evidence can never compel or coerce faith. So, that's unfortunate that that's what we're having to deal with, is blind faith, where people believe in things that don't have any evidence. They should have known from having the story of Santa Claus debunked for them that, you shouldn't believe in things that there's not any evidence for. Now, most Christians believe there is good evidence, but this book doesn't provide any. So now we're moving on to chapter 3, and let's see. Strobel asks, how many New Testament Greek manuscripts are in existence today? Metzger's eyes got wide. More than 5,000 have been cataloged, he said with enthusiasm. And that totally slaughters the amount of manuscripts that are available for people like Tacitus and Josephus, Roman historians, and also other Greeks and Homer. These things have just a single or double digits of manuscripts that are in existence, but Metzger's saying that there are more than 5,000 that have been cataloged. What this shows is that the Romans had slave scribes working on this and, putting out as many copies as they possibly could. Do you think a bunch of illiterate Jews in Palestine would have put out more than 5,000 copies that are still in existence? But then I'm not even sure if that's even needed to be true, because I found out more recently that a lot of these manuscripts that they're talking about are just like fragments of, like, one of them is the size of, I believe, like the size of a credit card. And it literally only has one complete word on it, which is kai, which is Greek for and. That's the only word on the fragment, and Metzger is counting that as one. So these numbers are inflated, is what I'm saying. So he says it's almost embarrassing how many copies there are in comparison with other works of antiquity. Well, it is embarrassing because they were done by slave scribes of the Romans. That's how you explain that. But instead, he says, they must have been written either by apostles themselves who were eyewitnesses. Oh, so this is the criteria of the church for authority. Must have been written either by apostles themselves who were eyewitnesses to what they wrote about, or by followers of apostles. So Mark was supposed to be a follower of Peter, and Luke was a follower of Paul. Matthew, I'm going to have to look at that. I don't believe that the Matthew who wrote the New Testament, part of the New Testament, the first gospel, is the same Matthew that is one of his followers, because Matthew copies Mark, and a lot of times, why would you do that? If you were there to observe the events, why would you copy what somebody else who wasn't there, but who was getting the info from Peter? Why would you copy them? So anyway, same is true with John. I think John was written much too late to have been written by the John that loved Jesus. Okay, survival of the fittest is what he's talking about the canon, which is exactly right. The fittest were the Roman slaves who were, existed in the thousands, who could copy these documents over and over again. It's being pushed. Incidentally, the Gospels, according to at least Abelard Reuchlin and Roma Piso, were really written as plays to be performed in front of audiences, especially since most people were illiterate. To really be able to, disseminate the story, there had to be some type of oral tradition to pass it on, more than just the, publishing the writings and so on. The New Testament books became canonical because no one could stop them doing so. Which is kind of a twisted way of saying that the Romans allowed them to be circulated, and they didn't allow anything else to be circulated except for Josephus. Those are like the only two things, works of history, that got out in the first century, until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And so he says, things like the Gospel of Thomas excluded itself. So that's kind of what he's saying, that the four Gospels are there for a reason, and these other Gospels of the Apocrypha and so on didn't make the cut because they didn't deserve to make the cut, is what he's saying. Which I don't know the exact nature of that argument, but I find it pretty naive to think that is the reason why those 4 particular gospels are the only ones who made the cut. There are dozens of gospels that are out there. I was reading one called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and it talks about how Jesus behaved when he was a little kid. He at one point, when he was 5 years old, he had got into some kind of argument or disagreement with some other little kid and killed him, just like cursed him dead. And he did a couple of other like very mean-spirited things like that. But then later on, it talks about how he had a teacher who he then fell over dead, but then he resurrected, or brought him back to life. It's really, really very nursery rhymey, and hardly can be taken seriously as having ever happened. Especially when you can see that these are the same type of stories that come from mythology. When it concerns Jesus, they give it the benefit of the doubt that it's real. But if it concerns anybody else, it's immediately called mythology. So that's really kind of the inconsistency. And it's even worse than mythology because it's complete fiction, because it's a psychological operation. It would be lucky if it were mythology, but it's actually complete propaganda. The authoritative nature of 20 of the 27 books in the New Testament, from Matthew through Philemon, plus 1 Peter and 1 John. Okay, so those 7, there's 7 books of Paul's epistles that have been questioned as whether he wrote them or not, or they were written by somebody else. I think the legit ones are Romans, I think 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Hebrews, and Philippians and Philemon, I believe. And the rest of them are supposed to be now frauds, written by somebody else. And now he's referring to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. That's from Josephus. And this Japanese guy, Yamauchi, says, "I know of no scholar," Yamauchi asserted confidently, "who has successfully disputed this passage." Talking about the passage from Josephus, where he says, James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Well, I dispute the passage because it was written by Josephus, who was the agent of the Romans. But secondly, you could also dismiss the passage because the who was called the Christ part appears to have just been thrown in there because he's actually referring to a different Jesus. He's got like 6 or 7 different Jesuses in War of the Jews. And but he just keeps going. We'll talk about that particular passage a little bit later as well. Okay, if indeed this is more Josephus, this is, so he says that phrase is not normally used of Jesus by Christians, so it seems authentic for Josephus. But the next phrase says, if indeed one ought to call him a man. This implies Jesus was more than human, which appears to be an interpolation. So Yamauchi does the good work of, keeping one of Josephus's phrases, but dismissing the other as an interpolation. So he leaves out, if indeed one ought to call him a man, but he leaves in Jesus, who was called the Christ. So that's a pretty good trade-off for him, I would say, to be, look like he's being honest. Okay, so from time to time, some people have tried to deny the existence of Jesus, but this is really a lost cause, he said with a tone of exasperation. There is overwhelming evidence that Jesus did exist, and these hypothetical questions are really very vacuous and fallacious. But I'd answer by saying this: Josephus was interested in political matters and the struggle against Rome, so for him, John the Baptist was more important. See, I love when there is overwhelming evidence that Jesus did exist. I would like him to give me one piece, just one piece of evidence that he existed that gets past the Roman origins hypothesis. All of the examples of him existing are Roman-created evidence. So Strobel asked him, how significant are these two references by Josephus? Highly significant, Yamauchi replied, especially since his accounts of the Jewish war have proved to be very accurate. For example, they've been corroborated through archaeological excavations at Masada, as well as by historians like Tacitus, who is another Roman royal, Tacitus. So any evidence from Tacitus is also completely suspect. He's considered a pretty reliable historian, that is, actually both Tacitus and Josephus, but they're both frauds. They're both propaganda experts. None of this stuff should be taken seriously, regardless of whether it's history, biblical stories, or mythology. None of these ancient people are trying to tell you the truth. I'm not even, today, probably that same statement would be true. But certainly then, these are people, the only people who are writing documents in this period are the Roman royals. They're writing everything under various pseudonyms. And so now he's going to the passage from Tacitus. Josephus is said to be really the only person in the first century, other than the New Testament, to corroborate the existence of Jesus. But then Tacitus comes in the early 2nd century, and also, so Christian apologists use Tacitus as well. But Tacitus was also a close-knit